Hi, everybody. My name is Myles Wallace, and I'm with Peak Performers. We're a nonprofit staffing and recruiting agency that helps professionals with disabilities find jobs and advance their careers. We also help clients find great talent as well. I'm here with Darla from Center for Disability Inclusion. Would you mind introducing yourself?
Yes, I'm Darla Wilkerson. I am the CEO here at the Center for Disability Inclusion. We're a organization that has been about 13 years now by a group of employer representatives that said, hey, we want to do more about hiring and retaining workers with disabilities. Our main mission is to work with businesses to help them advance their disability inclusion efforts in the workplace and marketplace.
And Darla, I brought you in for a very special topic of conversation today, and that is we are very briefly going to be covering the history of the Americans with Disabilities Act, but more importantly, we're going to be talking about the impact of it, as well as kind of where we're going from here. Does that sound good to you?
Sounds great.
For the start of this particular talk, I wanted to actually bring up 1935, the Social Security Act. In the picture here is a series of protesters that are demonstrating in order to try to get a little bit more rights and kind of guarantees and social safety nets available to them.
No, I really think what we need to keep in mind here is that this law created our Social Security program as well as insurance against unemployment. So it really was establishing a system of benefits for older workers, benefits for people who get hurt on the job, and then also aid for dependent mothers and children. But then, as we're here today, also to talk about the importance of how it established benefits for people with disability.
We see the ball start rolling with this particular movement right here, but it wasn't until 1956 that we finally saw disability benefits established under this law. So this really kind of carries a theme that all the disability legislation that we see is always a work in progress, and it does take time, and it's easy to get frustrated sometimes with the progress, but it's also important to kind of look back and see the tremendous progress that we've made too.
Any movement we've seen, any progress, and it starts with people saying, we need this, and here's why, and really making sure that their voices are heard.
And fast forwarding in time, we have 1945, the National Employ the Physically Handicapped Week. And the picture that we have on the screen is a series of workers sitting at a table that are currently using Braille to both read as well as to type on a typewriter as well.
What's interesting here too is the word handicapped, because our terminology as time moved forward into today, we don't really use that word a whole lot, but back then that was best practice. And even the picture showing the typewriter and the Braille, that technology piece was huge for that particular point in time. And this National Employee the Physically Handicapped Week was really an effort to educate the public about things related to disability and especially around employment. The Department of Labor was really looking at people coming back from World War II that had disabilities, and what are some services that could help them in terms of employment. As time went on, the word physically was dropped from this piece of legislation because it needed to be more than just people with physical disabilities. It has moved into more than just a week of recognizing the employment of people with disabilities, and now being October as National Disability Employment Awareness Month.
And we also see here about a 40-year lapse between kind of when we started to see it more in its modern iteration. But like you said, I think what really stands out to me here is that we finally start to put the focus on how do we find jobs for people with disabilities, or quote unquote the handicapped. Before, a lot of times the perception is that they are going to live off of their family members, they're going to be on the streets, they're not employable. So this is really where we start to see the conversation shifting in more of a tone that, yes, let's find them jobs. And maybe this is kind of the start of the conversation around what is an accommodation.
And I think it's important to keep in mind that many people want to work. Back then, many people wanted to work. What we have to remember today is that disability is not preventing people necessarily from working. Some may, but for the majority, people are wanting to work. It's just meeting that opportunity.
So the next thing that we see right here is we see John F. Kennedy surrounded by a group of people who is signing a piece of legislation. And this is 1963 when he signs the Community Mental Health Act.
Really, what is the most significant here is that it's providing federal funds to community mental health centers. Prior to that, a lot of what we saw was really what was called custodial isolation. And I think JFK even used those terms, custodial isolation. And with institutional living for many people, not only in mental health, but also physical disabilities, developmental disabilities, parents were told that's what you needed to do was put your child in some kind of institutional type of facility. And this really brought awareness to the fact that not only do people need to be out of those kinds of custodial isolation facilities, but be back in their particular communities, because many times people were in those facilities that were just so far away from even the community they were raised in. This is really focusing on helping folks, get back into that community, but also around employment as well. And even today, there's plenty of research that shows that work is so crucial in anyone's mental wellness.
I think that's incredibly important because throughout so much of history, yeah, people with disabilities have been either, living off of your family members or somehow ostracized from society, evolving all the way to the point of let's lock them up and put them away, almost like you would somebody in prison. But this is really significant departure from that, where they recognize that, hey, these are just people too.
For any of these acts that are signed into law, doesn't not mean that happens immediately for people. Things are slow to progress in many situations. And even today in the United States, people are living in institutional kinds of facilities. It's much, much better. And as a result of these kinds of acts, really has helped move that forward. But there's still a lot of work to do.
Speaking of work to do, we have 1973 Vocational Rehabilitation was established, and pictured in here, we can see a group of people, many of whom are in wheelchairs, bearing signs. Hey everybody, Miles from Peak Performers. Just wanted to issue a quick correction. I actually pulled the wrong image, and that is an image from 1977 and some of the protests that were happening in San Francisco. Now back to the show. I think that in 1973, this was important because many people currently, when they think of work and they think of people with disabilities, they associate that with voc rehab. And this is where it came about, right?
Absolutely. And, this is federal law prohibiting discrimination based on disability. This photo is capturing a lot of the images that many of us think of when we hear the word disability as someone with a physical disability. And yet there's many people with disabilities that are not as apparent. This is really catalyst for all of the sections within the Rehabilitation Act that are prohibiting discrimination. We
really saw that this continued to be a challenge throughout society. So right now we fast forward in time to 1977 and the 504 sit-in, and pictured here, we have a group of people, again, mostly in wheelchairs, who are currently looking out a window from a government office building. People with disabilities realized that the Voc Rehab Act wasn't enough, and they were still finding that a lot of times the onus was put on them as the person with the disability rather than the organization. And this is really where we started to finally see a shift to where it's like, okay, let's put the onus, let's put the burden of responsibility on the organization for making sure that you do have reasonable accommodations and that you're not discriminating against people.
The sit-in really supported the passing of Section 504 into law, and that just as part of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, like you mentioned. So it was so important for people to demonstrate that, hey, it passed, but what are we doing to ensure it? All of these things that we see of people are protesting or doing the sit-ins or those kinds of things is so important to honor those that did that. That has made things the way they are today. It's really moved the needle. We have people today that are doing those things that's going to be helping move the needle for the future as well.
You bring up a great point. So oftentimes the pictures that we envision in our head, like the coming up a couple of slides from now, is the picture of George H.W. Bush signing the legislation. While those are important, it's also incredibly important to recognize that this is all grassroots organization movement, and these are all individual peoples, often with disabilities or people that are connected to the disability movement, that are shouting, and oftentimes their voices are kind of lost to history, except for the impact that they made that eventually carries over and impacts the rest of us for generations to come. In March 12th of 1990, we have the Capitol crawl, and this is perhaps one of the most famous pictures of protests of people with disabilities. In the picture right here, you see in the center a girl who is crawling up the steps of a building, and she is outside the Capitol building. And this was kind of the culmination of a many week effort and many week demonstration. And this was kind of the final act where they were crawling up the steps of the Capitol building to kind of demonstrate that, hey, we have these laws in place, and yet we still cannot even get into the center of America. And fortunately, this picture really kind of took over a lot of the media at the time and really kind of lit a fire under politicians to make stuff happen too.
I think she was around 8 years old or something like that. And I can't remember her name, but I think that not just the fact that you have a young child doing this, but a young child that's advocating. I think there was about 1,000 people or so that marched that day, from the White House to the Capitol, and then somewhere around 60 or so that said, "Hey, we're going to crawl up these stairs."
I just want to take a second to kind of let this picture set in for the viewers. Just imagine that you were a wheelchair user and you find yourself where you stop your wheelchair at the bottom of a very large stone staircase. You get out and then you crawl on your hands and knees up the steps. You know, a lot of times people may see this picture and they see people that are weak or people that are somebody to pity. But really, what I see in this picture is I see heroes, and I see people that are incredibly strong and incredibly valiant, that are willing to take that step to get out of their wheelchair and crawl up stone building steps to the top of the Capitol to make their voices heard. We have kind of perhaps the most famous picture, and that is of George H.W. Bush signing the Americans with Disabilities Act. So, pictured here, you have the president at the time who is signing the piece of legislation, and to his right and to his left are individual advocates for disabilities. And in fact, if I remember correctly, the person to the right is wearing a cowboy hat, and he was famous for showing up to meetings, and everybody would know him by his cowboy hat too.
It's important to remember this is one of America's most significant and comprehensive pieces of civil rights, legislation that prohibits discrimination. And it helps also just guarantee that people with disabilities have the same rights that others do. A mainstream life, in America, that people can enjoy employment, they can enjoy being able to access, building, service, product, those kinds of things.
So many people that don't have a disability or develop a disability later in life are tangentially benefited from this kind of thing as well. In fact, so often what we kind of draw the analogy to is that the original designs for smartphones were actually developed for people with disabilities, and pretty much everybody else came along and said, actually, that's really great for me too. So a lot of times when we do see things like this, a lot of times there may be a lot of clamoring about the cost of the business or the challenges that it's going to impose on the organization. While it is a lot of upfront work, a lot of times it benefits so many people. You have a ramp to access a sidewalk, and how often have you pushed a shopping cart up onto said ramp and not had to figure out how to juggle a shopping cart onto the curb? All these things benefit us not only now, but in the event that we do develop a disability, because the reality of it is that you could develop a disability later on in life. The longer that you live, the more likely it is that you are going to develop a disability or multiple disabilities. And so these things are really not only protecting the people with disabilities right now, but they're protecting you in the future. The ADA turned into the ADAAA, as we kind of call it in the industry. What that really did is that really broadened the net for could be called a person with a disability and who could be protected under the law. So we particularly saw a lot of more inclusion for particularly like mental health illnesses, as well as chronic conditions that people may face as well. Thank you, Darla, for coming on to speak and to provide your insight into the history of the Americans with Disabilities Act and the history of disability inclusion in the United States. If you don't mind, though, could you tell me a little bit more about how a business might get involved with Center for Disability Inclusion?
Our organization is really, we exist because a lot of businesses need that kind of expertise around the disability inclusion piece. Many corporations have their overall diversity, equity, inclusion strategies, but disability inclusion is very minimal or sometimes non-existent in those strategies. And so they reach out to us and they ask for that kind of assistance. We provide that through consultation and training, those kinds of things. And a lot of our work is centers around showing folks that this is a journey. There's not a destination, right? It's ongoing. And so part of what we do is help those companies create a roadmap, if you will, to guide that journey, and then provide that assistance along the way. We meet companies where they're at on that journey. If you feel like you're just starting out, that's okay. If you feel like you've been doing work for a while, but you need a little extra support, that's fine as well. Joining us is one way to get that. We are a nationally based organization. We're headquartered in Kansas City. One of the ways to get in touch with us is through our website at centerfordisabilityinclusion.org, or people can email me directly at dwilkerson@centerfordisabilityinclusion.org.
If you are a business and you want to take next steps, you can contact Darla. I will include the links that she mentioned in the comments to this video. Also, if you want to hire somebody right away, Peak Performers is happy to work with you and happy to help you find either your first person or your next person that has a disability to join your workforce. Thanks again, Darla. Really appreciate your time and your insight into this. Again, this has been Myles from Peak Performers. We look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.
Thank you.